do this, and we will get all of the appropriate links as soon as we get Leah in the room, and I will start with the introduction here. So thank you all so much for your patience on Tuesday night. Again, Senator Morgeau felt just terrible. And so I'll go ahead and start on the introduction here. So hello and welcome to our second webinar of our OPI Indian Education for All Background Knowledge series on sovereignty. My name is Jennifer Statham, and I am an Indian Education for All implementation specialist at OPI. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We apologize and thank you for your flexibility with Tuesday's webinar. We have rescheduled Senator Morgeau's session for Thursday, December 1st. So next week, there will be no webinars. And so please enjoy the holiday, and the following week, we will host 2 sovereignty webinars on Tuesday, the 29th and Thursday, the 1st. So Tuesday, the 29th will be with Wes Martell. I'm really excited about that one. He has done a lot of work for his tribe with natural resources and water management. So he'll be on the 29th, and then Thursday, the 1st will be Senator Morgeau. And I just saw that Ms. Whitford has joined us, so excellent. So for this series, each webinar will be recorded, and a link to the recordings as they're available will be both on our Indian Ed webpage as well as on your reminder letters that you'll receive before each webinar. And in this series, participants will remain muted with their cameras off so we can focus on the presenter and their content. Feel free to use the chat if you have any questions or comments. We'll also take a few minutes at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. Your feedback on the feedback surveys from our other webinars has brought you this sovereignty series. So please make sure to complete the feedback survey that will be posted at the end of the webinar tonight, whether you need professional development units, formerly known as renewal units, or not. Even if you are just a member of the community at large, we are happy for your feedback, and always are seeking to improve and provide content that is meaningful and relevant for Indian country. So and make sure to do that. The surveys are only open for 1 day after the webinar, so make sure to get those in. And again, thank you so much for making this series happen. I couldn't be more excited about it, and we have an incredible lineup of presenters throughout the series. Tonight, I would like to introduce and give a warm welcome to Leah Whitford. Leah has been an ardent supporter of Indian Education for All for many years. She is currently working for Browning Public Schools as a BNAS, or Blackfeet Native American Studies District instructional coach, where she assists teachers with incorporating Indian Ed for All in their curriculum and lesson plans. Leah also served as a Montana state legislator, both as a representative and a senator from 2013 to 2017. She has 3 children and 4 grandchildren. Leah enjoys teaching about our history and culture to those wanting to know more about tribal communities. And Leah, welcome to you. I am so delighted that you are here. And hopefully I can find you in here somewhere. Let's see, there she is. Make her a co-host. Oops, no, sorry about that. Technical difficulties, make co-host, there we go, yes. There you are, Leah, now you can come off of mute. And go back up here, and we'll do that. And there we are. Yay! Welcome. So I don't know if you were able to hear your introduction, but you are introduced, and you can get ready to go whenever you're ready. We're ready for you.
Okay, hi everybody. Okay, ni stu ni daniku me stuaki, Leah Whitford. And I'm just kind of looking at quickly going through the chat just to kind of see who we have before I get to moving along here. So I don't know about you guys in other parts of the state, but right now we're like we're a little bit chilly, a little bit icy, and that always makes for an interesting drive or any kind of moving around. So I wish you all safe travels wherever you are and wherever you're going. And I look forward to just giving you some of my insight into tribal governance. And I come at this from a number of different avenues. And so with that, Jennifer, we're going to go ahead, and I have a PowerPoint.
Awesome. So you should be able to share your screen.
Okay. Oops. There's all kinds of stuff up there. Can you guys see that?
Yep. So if you just go up to slideshow and play from start. There you go.
Okay, do I have this still up there?
Yep. And
Okay.
then the buttons are a little strange on the bottom, but they're in your lower left-hand corner. And sometimes you have to run your mouse over them in order for you to see, but you can also use the arrow keys if you have a keyboard.
Okay. So, all right. So are you seeing on the right side of everybody's names, or is it just me
So if you
on my slide?
if you click on the participants, the participants will show, and if you click on it again, it'll go away. So no, we only see it if we click on it individually.
Okay. So I'm just going to introduce myself. I know you did a lovely job. Thank you, Jennifer. And I just want to, let everybody know that where I come from is a background of over 33 years of teaching Native American studies and Blackfeet studies. I was a high school teacher for a long time. I was an instructor and a department chairperson for Blackfeet Community College for over a decade. I also worked for the tribe as a planner. And then as a state legislature, I was a representative for one term and a senator for one term. And currently I'm an instructional coach for the Blackfeet Native American Studies program here at Browning Public Schools. So I've been involved in education for a number of years, have taught Blackfeet studies for as long as I've been in education, and it's been a wonderful opportunity for me to learn and to share information with students. And these are my experiences that kind of have helped me to understand tribal sovereignty and to just be able to have maybe a different perspective than other people. So, it's been an interesting journey. I've enjoyed the challenges of trying to find information and to understand that information so that I can share with students, and if I can share with community members, that's great. And so over the years, it's taking a lot of self-guided learning in order to get where I'm at. So I don't expect, teachers that are in other schools to just know all this information, because it does take some effort and it does take, some research on your part. It's also asking people in tribal communities or around tribal communities, asking them for assistance, asking for, for them to help you understand tribal government a little bit better. And that can go into all kinds of different subjects when you're teaching. It can be incorporated into the lower grades, whether it's in your pre-K, talking about tribal councils or tribal areas, and whether it's, teaching at a high school or even at the adult level. So it just is really helpful if you're able to do those types of things on your own. But I also understand that it's a little challenging if you're not close to any of these areas. And so I rely heavily as a teacher on online resources. Luckily, those are available for us. But I've utilized OPI website and the teaching tools that they have for us just, you know, all the time. And even when I wasn't in the education field per se, I was still going to OPI's website just because I knew it was there and it's open to anybody. I'd go on there and check things out and do some research through OPI's Indian Ed for All web pages. So, you know, awesome job. Thank you for doing that for us, OPI. Really appreciate it. So like I said, I'm going to come at this presentation from a different couple different avenues. One, I am a tribally enrolled member of the Blackfeet tribe, and the other is I've been a teacher for a number of years, and then as a senator. And trying to understand tribal sovereignty sometimes can get really overwhelming. And so just trying to put on all these different hats and determine, you know, what is the best way to learn about this particular subject, and most importantly, to understand it and then be able to present it back. Sometimes it's challenging, but fortunately, I have a few friends in a few places that were helpful for me to know and understand a little bit better about tribal sovereignty. So probably one of the most important things is when you're teaching students throughout this state is that we do have 8 reservations now federally recognized. We've had 8 reservations state recognized for a number of years. And federally recognized, many of you know that Little Shell acquired that recognition in just a couple of years now. So, and it doesn't mean that they haven't been around. It just means that the federal government, they needed that recognition at that level. So when I'm teaching about tribal sovereignty, it's important to recognize that there are 8 reservations. But those 8 reservations are just that. That's a boundary. You have tribes within those reservations, and there are 13 in our state. So some of the reservations have a couple of different tribes that live within those boundaries. And so when you're teaching about sovereignty, it's important to recognize that every single tribe has that same mentality of, you know, we're sovereign and we have a government to government relationship. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the government to government relationship here in a little bit. But I want to do a shout out. The last presenter, Walter, he did a fabulous job teaching about federal Indian policy and some of the policies that lay the groundwork for where we're at today. He covered in his presentation. And so if you haven't got an opportunity to look at that first presentation on tribal sovereignty, I strongly encourage you to do that. Like I said, I taught at Blackfeet Community College for quite a few years. And one of the classes that I taught was federal Indian law and policy. And it wasn't until I sat down and listened to Walter Fleming's presentation that it just kind of like punched a aha moment for me. And I was like, oh yeah, that's right. You know, those particular laws that he was talking about, or those particular cases that he was referring to in his presentation, are really important to understand if you're going to get into tribal government and teach about it, or if you're going to talk about tribal sovereignty, then, you know, having a little bit of that background. And he did a really nice job in the way that he presented it in a nice flowing timeline and went right through each one of those, so that, you know, as a learner, as the student that day, I could follow along, and it was, you know, it was easy for me to just say, oh yeah, you know, that's right. this is, I forgot about that piece of legislation, or I forgot about that law. And then as he was speaking, I was looking them up, and just to kind of refresh what I had known about federal Indian law and policy. And so with that being said, the resources that he shared with us in that first presentation, of those of you that are trying to get a grasp of tribal sovereignty, I would really recommend looking through those resources and just getting familiar a little bit more about the history involved in federal Indian law and policy. So I'm not going to go over a big long timeline, and I'm surely not going to go back over the things that he shared. And I know that we have some really stellar presenters coming up, and I know that they'll do a wonderful job of going through some of those timelines with you, and delving into a little bit more of the law or policy in a more in-depth avenue than I'm going to do. So one of the things that I think is important is, first of all, students need to realize where they are at in the state of Montana and their relationship to where the tribal reservations are. So, resources like this are on OPI's website. And, like I said, you can access those, utilize them. There's some great opportunities for you to teach about the different tribes. And I'm going to share a few, because I'm a teacher at heart and have been an educator all my life. I think that at the end, I have some handouts that you can access, and I'll make sure Jennifer gets a copy of those so we can put them up for you. But sometimes as a teacher, we just don't have time to make a lot of things, and we need to be able to just access them. So, that's what's so nice about the IEFA resources. So one, you want to make sure that you're talking about the tribes. These little circles with all these little designs on them have a lot of meaning. And each one of those seals for the tribe is a history lesson in itself, and really gives you some insight into what the tribal people, leaders, or people that were drawing them really had in mind when they were creating them to represent the tribes that they were created for. One of the things that I wanted to visit with you all about is to talk about the balancing act when it comes to tribal sovereignty. And when we're talking about tribes and who they work with, they deal with multiple jurisdictions. They deal with counties, they're dealing with the states, and they're dealing with the federal government, and the other tribes as well, and not just in this state, but throughout the United States. So we're looking at, our tribal governments that we have in place, that a number of these individuals, when they get elected into office, they're not just there to take care of the social issues that tribes are faced with. They're also running multi-million-dollar corporations, which is their tribal enterprises. And they're also taking care of very large populations of people in a way that, sometimes they're stretched in their budgets, they're stretched in their man hours, the amount of resources that they have. And so how do you get, a job done if you're having to go through these layers of jurisdiction? And sometimes that can get really bottlenecked, and it can get real frustrating for those of us that are trying to get maybe something done. Maybe we have a time limit and we're trying to reach out to somebody, and we want their attention here and now. And if you're trying to access tribal governments, you ought to know that there's a process, and it's and that process is defined by the tribe themselves. So even though I'm a tribal member, I don't have any special magic, wand to get access. I'm like every other citizen. I have to go through the same channels as everybody else. But as a tribal member, I do also have, they do have certain obligations to their membership. And so, yeah, we do have certain things that, we're afforded as far as tribal members, but we also need to recognize that our tribes are dealing with a multitude of people and issues. And so it's important for all of us to just recognize that, there's a process, and there's lots of things happening in tribal governments that maybe we don't have the privy of knowing, or we probably don't want to know to some extent. But it's important to be patient when you're working with tribal governments or tribes. And I say that because I know that possibly there's a few state employees that may be in on these this presentation, or maybe you're working with a program that needs a tribal signature, or maybe you want your students to go and see or visit a tribal council meeting, or anything like that. So just understanding that there's a process is really important. So every one of those tribes that I had up on the screen earlier has the authority to self-govern. And like I said, the past presenter laid the groundwork for some of that early federal Indian law and policy for us to understand, try to understand. And so one of the things that is an area that I'm just like, this is something that I had to learn about on my own. I didn't at the time take any kind of federal Indian law and policy class. When I was going through school, I didn't even know I was going to be a teacher. And so, it just wasn't on my radar at the time. And so when I started teaching Blackfeet studies, I was teaching kind of the cultural part of it, doing a little bit of the language. And when it came to the history, I was doing a little bit of, basic kind of history information. What I come to recognize is that in order to understand tribes and how they've came to be and how they operate, you really need to know about the treaties, executive orders, and the agreements and laws that lay the groundwork for tribes. And what I mean by that is just about every tribe has a treaty with the United States. And those treaties, laid out what maybe not necessarily what we can expect word for word, but there's some interpretation of the language that over the years has been through the ringer in the way of policies being generated, laws being generated, and court cases that help define, what those obligations are going to be on behalf of the government, and what tribes can expect as tribal entities or nations. So I guess one of the things that I would strongly encourage you to do is, if you're working with a particular tribe or on a reservation, then really look at the treaties that's their foundation. That's the foundation for our tribes. And this does give our tribes that authority to self-govern. Excuse me. The other thing that for the Blackfeet tribe, and I can only speak for the Blackfeet tribe because I don't speak for the Blackfeet tribe. I speak on this history part of it. Just knowing about these things. So it's not just treaties that also define who we are. And treaties were not the only things that defined our boundaries. The other thing that took place was executive orders. And this is where you could talk to your students about government to government relationships, because when it came to treaties, you might want to discuss with your students, who had to ratify those treaties. And that's when you can start pulling together vocabulary lists for your students so that they understand what some of these terms may mean. And I'm hopeful that we can get some of our lower grades talking about treaties and getting an understanding of those particular pieces are really important for tribes. Executive orders help define boundaries, and later they dropped that term treaties, and the federal government started using agreements. And so, for an example, the Blackfeet tribe has 2 treaties, I believe 4 executive orders, and I don't have my notes right in front of me. And we have 2 agreements and, a whole slew of laws. But those treaties, executive orders, and agreements have helped define our boundaries as a tribal nation. When those treaties were negotiated and those executive orders and agreements were signed into law, what tribes faced was the loss of millions of acres of land and access to a number of different natural resources. And what that means is, in exchange for those, we expect trust responsibilities. And those trust responsibilities is what assists our tribal nations today. When it comes to federal appropriations, the federal money that is set aside for tribes, just because there's 13 reservation or 13 tribes in the state of Montana, doesn't mean that, of the $1 billion ticket going out to tribes, that those 13 tribes are divvying up that $1 billion. No, that means that there are 573 tribal nations that get a portion of that. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So before I get into the appropriations and talk a little bit more about self-governance and further into the discussion of what all that means, I think it's really important that I pick three, federal and law and policy pieces. And the reason why I did that is because, again, the presenter before laid the ground. These are things that I want, I think are important for us to understand when we're teaching our students about tribal lands. These are the three that I picked out. So the Dawes Act.
Excuse me, Leah. While you're on tribal lands, we have a question in the chat that is very an important question. What is it meant by trust responsibility, please?
Okay. Trust responsibility is when we had treaty agreements signed, the government in some of the language of the treaties says that they will provide for short-term, maybe annuities or goods and services to tribes. And for a number of those services, there's not a limited amount of time. So in other words, it didn't say, and something you should know about treaties is that they may have been agreed upon in the early 1800s. They still apply today. They don't lose, their validity just because they're over 100 years old. It's kind of like our US Constitution, if you will. Just because it's an old document doesn't mean that we just throw it out because it's a new decade or whatever. It continues to help govern us. And so those treaties have that same longevity. Trust responsibility on on the federal government side is that they're going to provide certain types of services, certain types of things for tribes. So whether that be healthcare, education, whether that's going to be assistance for tribes to be able to function. And one of the things that, I'm not going to get real in depth into, but tribes don't tax. And so where do we get our money to be able to provide services, to provide the things that they do for their membership or for the reservation? So those trust responsibilities are those things that were tied into those treaty obligations that that the government agreed upon when they signed those with tribes. And I'm sorry, I'm not paying attention to the chat. So thank you, Jennifer, if there's anything else. So in the Dawes Act of 1887, this was when you had large blocks of tribal land that were all together. It was all, it was in one big piece. What happened with the Dawes Act is that started an allotment process, and you'll see that there's a map over on the side with all of these different colors to it. And you have tribal, you have reserve, you have allotted, you have fee. When that Dawes Act went into place, what it did is it took that big chunk of land and it started, they started divvying it up into smaller chunks. And those chunks were then based upon population of the tribes. Those pieces of land were allotted to tribal members. And once they received a certain amount, and there's specific numbers that were associated with the allotment period. And so in tribal properties, you'll see, or tribal land, you'll see that sometimes people were allotted 40 acres, sometimes they were allotted 80, sometimes it equaled 320. So it just depended on how many people they had enrolled at that time or recognized as tribal members. A lot of times enrollment didn't come in until later, and we'll talk about that soon. So once they got that land broken up into these small squares that you see, and it was divvied up among the tribal people, anything that was left over was opened up for sale. And that's where you see that little ad there, Indian land for sale. And so that's why you see over on the side fee land, allotted land. And when tribal members were allotted land at the time, those lands were held in trust by the US government, and we could not sell them. We couldn't use them for collateral and things like that. So it was, to some degree, somewhat beneficial. It defined, here's a piece of land for you, develop it. Sometimes though, on our reservation, for an example, sometimes people got land up toward the mountains, and some people got land down in the prairie. Some were located next to water sources and some were not. And so it was just an uneven distribution sometimes of property. So that Dawes Act really took a big chunk of tribal lands, opened it up to non-tribal members, and then after a period of time, the government was giving deeds to the tribal lands, to the owners of those, to tribal members, and they could then sell those properties. What we did see at that time, and it's been documented, that number of tribal members didn't have resources, income resources. And so some of them would put up their deed as, I guess, collateral to a trading or a grocery store, and then, signed that property over for, a bill they owed. So it was really a real dark time for our tribal people around that Dawes Act time. And some of our reservations were severely hit because of, in the way of, of land loss, because of the Dawes Act. So you fast forward up a little bit of time, and I think I might have Merriam report spelt wrong. I think it's only one R. Apologize for that. So in 1926, the federal government wanted a survey done based upon some reports that they were getting from tribal communities and from friends of tribal communities, saying how deplorable the conditions were on reservations, that they sent out individuals to do a survey of land and a survey of reservations, and just to see, what it was like for the Indian nations. And when they were done with that in 1928, they did the presentation, and the problem of the Indian administration, you see that on your screen, that report opened the eyes to a lot of the lawmakers and to people across the nation about the conditions that tribes were living under, and really brought forward, some of the sad truths that were happening because of the Dawes Act, what it was doing to tribal people. And so some of the things that were written in that report are, they talked about the lack of education, quality education for Indian students, the inconsistency of education for Indian students. Some children were able to go to school and some weren't. It was just kind of a hit and miss type of system. The health of the Indian nations at that time was not good. We had sanitation issues that were just just unbelievable. You had people living in overcrowded housing. Some people didn't have proper insulation or installation of windows and doors and floors, and there were issues of inconsistent heating. So there was a lot of that going on. And then the actual health of Indian nations at that time was not good as well. You had, poor diets. There was tuberculosis was kind of going off the charts. A number of things that were brought forward by that report. The other thing that it recognized is that tribes were really strapped, not only financially, but just strapped in the way of being able to govern themselves, being able to have the resources to be able to properly take care of the people that were still within those reservations or considered tribal members. So it brought forward those types of issues. The other thing that they recognized in there was the economy was not doing well at all. There was very few jobs. If there were jobs, those were being outsourced. There's just all kinds of issues and problems that Indian tribes were facing across the nation that came out in this Merriam report. And it is a very big, long report. And no, I haven't read it, in its entirety. It's a book about, yay thick. And as a teacher, I skim and I look for the conclusion, or I'm looking for the abstract, or I'm looking for the summary, and things that you would teach your students to do. So that particular report helped change for us as tribes, helped change some policies. So a few years later, they start building upon that report and trying to figure out a way to help tribes better govern. And so you have the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. And really what that did is it helped tribes to establish a set of laws, if you will, that will help govern and help define certain things. And, you know, there are some people that will look at tribal constitutions and bylaws, and, you know, they'll talk about how, you know, we've outgrown them as nations. They need to change. Excuse me. And some tribes have, they've amended them, they've changed them. But really, from my perspective, just looking at history and how it unfolded, it really did help our tribes in a way of helping us to really have that defined relationship within the tribal government system itself, and then building and understanding a little bit more about that nation to nation trust responsibility, and really down to the self-governance. So hopefully you're getting an opportunity sometime to look at the constitutions and to delve into a little bit more about the Indian Reorganization Act as you're teaching. Okay. I am having heck. Okay, there we go. Okay. When tribes were finally at that point of creating constitutions, and not all tribes have them, and that I should make that clear. Not all tribes went with the constitution and bylaws. There was a model that was sent out, and you'll see that if you get into it a little bit further. There was a model that was brought around. There was, you know, if you look at a number of the constitutions, you'll see that a number of things are all the same for a number of tribes that have them. And it was just that was a model. Tribes could change things as they wanted. And then once it was adopted by the tribe, it was sent out to the feds and recognized as, okay, this is our document that helps us have that understanding of what's what. So what tribes have the authority to govern and to oversee. Some of them do them, you know, I'll talk about that in just a minute. So here's a number of different things that tribes have the authority to govern. So they can make laws. They can create housing, you know, opportunities for their memberships. They can oversee the police forces, their tribal court systems. They can manage their natural resources. They can preserve their tribal languages and cultures. They can determine who is a member of a tribe. They have healthcare systems in place, and they can determine, you know, what they're going to do with tribal property. So a lot of authority. And so when I was a legislator and maybe a agency or a department was wanting to get a hold of the tribe, and they would say, you know, well, what do you think the tribe, you know, what is their stance on it? I, as a tribal member, am just a citizen like anybody else. I don't speak for the tribe. I can't speak for the tribe. And only those individuals that are elected and have been given that authority can do that. And so there was times when I would have to tell departments or agencies that, you know, I can't speak for the tribe. And even though they would say, well, you're a tribal member. Well, I'm a US citizen too, but I don't, you know, I don't make those calls for um, those, you know, government agencies like to that degree. So I think that's important to understand. And one of the things that happened when I went to the legislature, one of the past representatives, Mr. Bob Jarvis, he used to serve in the legislature way before I did. And he's a family member. And I went to talk to him, and he invited me into his home, and he told me a little bit about what to expect when I went down to serve. And then he handed me a document, and he said, this is a document that we put together, that they had put together when he was a representative. And it was a handbook for a handbook for legislators. And I'm trying to remember the title of it. I had it actually on my slide, and I think I took it off. But he told me, he said, you know, maybe you guys should have this redone and updated. And I looked through it, I read through it, and it was helpful to some degree, but sometimes you learn by just going through or practicing. And so that was a document that I brought to the tribal what is he? Used to be Jason Smith, and he was the tribal liaison. Jennifer, what is their title?
I believe it's the Director of Indian Affairs now,
Okay.
and it is Misty Cool.
Okay, so prior to Misty Cool, it was Jason Smith. And
Yep, Jason Smith.
Yep. And so I brought it to their office, and I asked him if they would look into getting this updated. And I believe Casey Lozar was working for the governor's office at that time too. And so they took it, they updated it and put it back out there. And the reason why I bring that up now is because a lot of times we don't know that there are these tribal relations people that we can count on and ask, you know, how do we reach out to tribes? How do we connect with them? And these individuals oftentimes know the process. You know, there's every single one of those tribes has within their constitution policies that lay out when they're going to have their general meetings, and those are open to the general public. And you can request to be, you know, to go to them. A lot of times some of their documents are open to the public, their meeting minutes. And so, you know, you can request those are, you know, that's information that that is available for us. So when agencies or departments were looking at how do I connect to a tribal program, or how do I connect to a tribal entity, a lot of times I would reach out to the tribe and ask them. You know, I would call the tribal offices and ask one of the admin assistants, you know, how can we contact so and so in this department, or how can we get a hold of somebody that would come down and give testimony on behalf of the tribe. And really, you know, not everybody is given that authority. Again, tribes speak for themselves, they are their own entity, and they're at the same level as other government agent or other governing bodies, like our state governor and our legislators and those agencies. We have that within those tribal governments, and including the federal government. So, you know, we need to have those avenues of how do we make those connections. So as a tribal member, you know, I have certain things, and one of the things that I don't have is the authority to speak on behalf of. I can speak about, but you know, those things are reserved for our tribal government.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat. If a reservation has multiple tribes, does each tribe have the authority, or is there a higher authority for the overall reservation that tribes have to communicate with?
So they all have their process. So if there's more than one tribe on a reservation, then they within their policies have that that laid out for them. So you might have different districts. I know there's a tribe that has districts. So those districts are represented by individuals, and it may even be laid out within the tribal constitution of that group as to how they're going to have representation for those different tribes. So if there's two different tribes on one reservation, those documents are the ones that help guide the tribes and help us understand, well, okay, you know, can anybody just apply to be a tribal council person? Well, if you have two different tribes, then you may have to prove that you are of one particular tribe as a member to be able to run for that office. And so within the tribal government itself, they would have that defined. I hope that's helpful. So there have been a number of Supreme Court cases, decisions, and legislation that have helped define, and sometimes maybe not too helpful, define relationships. And sometimes they're difficult to understand. That's why it's important to reach out to people. There's some really good organizations out there that can help you if you have questions. I know that if you go to the Bureau of Indian Affairs website, there's some Q&As there. You know, how do you communicate with tribes? And there's, you know, lots of resources for you guys to be able to access in order to just learn a little bit more about what is that government to government relationship look like. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was talk a little bit about is the appropriations, the funding for tribes, because it's different than you know, a city or a town. It's different from any other group, really, any other group. So again, you know, talking about going back to that trust responsibility, federal government has that responsibility to be able to offer you know, resources for the services that tribes had agreed upon. And so some of those tribal government services may be water and sewer infrastructure, maybe it's roads. For natural resources, maybe they have timberlands, maybe they have grazing, all these different things, healthcare and education. All of those areas, all of those services, tribes have to figure out where they're going to be getting that money to be able to make sure that those things are properly taken care of for the people within that reservation. And so when it comes to the appropriation of that money through the federal government, a lot of times there are areas that are not covered and you'll hear it from tribal members or from tribes. They'll say that, we get money to cover some of our health expenses, but it doesn't take care of everything. There are some inconsistencies and there's some gaps there. And because of that, we still have tribal nations, tribal communities that are lagging behind in their healthcare. And so, you know, and it can affect an entire group of people. So when people drive through some of our tribal communities and they look around and they say, hey, how come these buildings don't look very new, and how come your roads are not very passable and things like that. And it's because, remember, way back in those previous slides, I told you there's a number of tribes that they're all getting a piece of that dollar, and there are inequities within that deviate, or that when they start distributing out, it's not all equal. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So one of the things that happens with the appropriations is sometimes that funding just does not cover everything that they need to. And one of them that seems to just kind of get left behind oftentimes is that infrastructure piece. And so sometimes what they'll do is they'll have, instead of giving it directly to tribes, they'll put that money through a department. I'm gonna, whoops. So these are some of the agencies that, these are the agencies and departments that oftentimes receive the appropriations that then distribute out to tribes. And so it is really important for our tribal leadership all across the nation that they understand, when it comes to the appropriation of money. And the reason why I can speak a little bit to this is because at the state level, our number one job as legislators was to pass a budget and to make sure that we have money there for all the different agencies, and that they're covered, and those services are provided to the people. So when it comes to appropriations, you go through this budget and you're nitpicking every little thing. And sometimes, people say, oh, we're going to cut out the fluff. Well, if you're cutting out the fluff in health and human services, sometimes you might be cutting out, a service that is so important for a particular group of people that, you don't even recognize that was, their only means of financial support was maybe that appropriation. And so they have to be real careful about, what they're cutting and what they're providing, because again, the inequities are there. And what I mean by inequities is, again, you have 500 and some tribes, and not everybody has a large reservation. Sometimes the populations are huge and sometimes they're not. Some people have, or some tribes have large land base, and other people do not, other tribes do not. So it's not, a cookie cutter where you can just say this works for here, it's going to work over here. We have different needs. Every tribe has different needs, and sometimes those don't get communicated out. And so it's really up to the tribal governments and those tribal governments advocating for their needs. And what some of the tribal governments have done is, by regions, they've organized, and they have entities that will go and speak on their behalf And so they meet a lot of times within these regions to have these discussions. They take appointees from tribal council members that were elected, and they serve on these committees. And that in itself can be that's a good thing, but it sometimes can be a hindrance, because some of our tribes, their elected officials are only there for a couple years, and then there's a change. And it's just like you know, representatives, they're only there for 2 years. And if you have a constant revolving door of new people, that institutional knowledge, if it's not getting handed down, you know, they're sitting there spinning their wheels trying to get caught up and figure out, you know, the system. So tribes face that just like other you know, elected officials. So here are your different agencies that receive appropriations for tribes, and then those distributions go out to to tribes. And sometimes they're a pass through, other times, in other words, it goes right from them to the tribe, and then other times it goes to another agency, and they determine how it's going to be distributed out. And maybe there's a competitive part to it, and so you might have to apply for it through grant process. um, and so, you know, that's a part of trying to get the funding that is necessary. So some of the challenges that tribes face is the layers of bureaucracy. And these are years and years of, you probably heard that term, dependent domestic nations. And so for a while there was attitude that tribes didn't know how to govern themselves. They couldn't, you know, manage money. They couldn't manage resources. So they assigned somebody to do it. And then once they had to give that up and back to the tribe, then they put these layers of, okay, well, you got to do this, 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 and this. And so that really does have a hindrance on how accessible resources are for tribes in any number of those departments that were listed. A number of, you know, for a number of years, many of our tribes were dependent on federal programs to help them, you know, fund a project, and they become reliant on it. And then, like I said, in the appropriation process, maybe they say we're going to cut that out, and so that funding is no longer there. So there's just this, you know, cycle that sometimes happens, um and it gets difficult, you know, kind of, they might get discouraged and say, you know, I'm not going to apply for that, or I'm not going to go and ask for that. It doesn't seem to be important. But they're always, tribal governments are always looking out for the people. You know, how could we best help our people? And so, you know, they figure it out, and they have to overcome a lot of things in order to be able to offer those different types of programs that we have available. On a judicial system, there's you know, there's a fluctuation there. It's influx. It's constantly moving. There isn't a lot of times there isn't a separation of powers, and so their autonomy isn't there. And so, you know, that can cause problems. And sometimes those resources are not there for that judicial system to properly work. And so people get a little skeptical when it doesn't seem to be working. And so some people are real critical of that area. And I think it's going to take a lot of work in order for tribes to get their judicial systems into a working order that, you know, we're all comfortable with. A lot of times programs are scrutinized. And what I mean by that is sometimes they have way more hoops to jump through in order to get their funding, or or even to have a change in their order. So it gets really, it really gets hard for some of those program people to try and get these services out to their membership. Again, the inequitable measurements, lumping all the tribes together, and those are, that just seems to be a constant. And then there is a constant need for tribes to continue to hold the federal government accountable for their trust responsibility. And if we don't stay on top of it as tribes, then, there things can happen. And that's where you get the history of the Eloise Cabell case, and that trust responsibility of taking care of tribal funds wasn't happening, and mismanagement of those funds. And so we know what happened there. Eloise took the federal government to court and sued them, and proved that that trust responsibility was not being adhered to. And so tribes are constantly trying to make sure that the federal government is living up to their trust responsibilities, and that's important. To be self-sustaining, tribes, are looking at trying to be less dependent on federal governments, and that means, with food sovereignty, how do we make sure that we're able to take care of their own. A number of tribes are becoming energy developers, making sure that they, have a piece of the grid. They're working on building capital and the human capacity, trying to train and get the training for their people, not only members, but people within their reservations, just to make sure that, they can provide services for everybody. I think tribes have to learn to, and have had to learn to, deal with outside influences. So we have people that, there are organizations that want to come in and say, this is the best way to do things. And tribes have to be real diligent about checking into it, making sure that it's reputable, and things are going to happen to the benefit for the tribe. And then they, just regionally organized in order to get more equitable treatment of funds, and to meet those unmet needs. Tribes have constantly been, reaching out and trying to make sure that people are there to represent them at various levels, whether it's at the county level, whether it's at the state level, or the federal level. So self-govern, what does it look like today? Well, today our tribes are creating their own laws, their own ordinances, their resolutions. Again, vocabulary words for your students. They're creating their own economic opportunities, and they have tribally owned businesses and enterprises. And this is putting their membership and the people within their areas, putting them to work. And that's important, to be, self-sustaining in that way. A number of the tribes are guiding and supporting their educational efforts. They're revitalizing or encouraging people to learn their tribal languages and to learn their cultural ways. And I think that those are all important. And they provide services for all residents on the reservation, whether they're enrolled or not. And I think sometimes people forget that they're only there serving tribal members. That's not true. A number of our tribal reservations have to provide all of the services for everybody, and with a limited budget. So tribal sovereignty, taking our ancient teachings and applying them to today, learning skills that help us survive and thrive, and skills that can provide for themselves and their families. And those are individual things that we can all do as tribal people. And then a couple of the tribal sovereignty examples that I pulled was, just recently I was visiting with a classroom, and the student said, the teacher asked them, "What'd you do this weekend?" And they said, "I went hunting." And he asked, "Did you get anything?" And the young lady says, "Yeah, I got an elk." And I thought, I want to be in your camp. And then another young gentleman talked about how he got a deer, and they asked him, well, what kind, and he told them. And I think, I think that's pretty awesome that our youth are learning those responsibilities of how to care for themselves, and that's food sovereignty. And tribes have to regulate that. They have fish and game departments that pull forward policies and laws that help govern that part of their natural resources. And those foods that are natural to us help us fight those viruses and disease, and they help maintain a healthy body. In schools, in our school, we have students that are learning how to bead and to sew and to make a lot of different cultural items. And those are building skill sets for our students. Those students can take those and they can and perfect them and become, their own little entrepreneur if they wanted to. So becoming self-sustaining through ancient teachings, that sovereignty. For us, or for me, calling on our resources, Natusi, the sun, to help us and to reground us, and to always remember that, who we are, and to just know that we've been taking care of this land and our people for millennia. We're going to continue to do that. And how we do that is making sure that we're taking care of one another. So I promised you some teaching tools. And so here's something that I put together for our school. And what I did is I took one of the resources that was on OPI's IFA website, and I just cut and paste this map, and then took the flags from all of the tribes and created a matching worksheet. And they can fill in, what tribes are where. It's an opportunity for them to do research about the tribes. They can compare the information, create fun facts about tribes. What do they look like? How does it differ from the past to now? Maybe even, how do tribes differ? Look up who the latest tribal council members are. We just got done with an election, and that election was statewide. Well, we have tribes that are going through elections as well throughout the state. Some of them are happening in the spring, sometimes they happen in the summer. Have the students look at each tribe's website, and look and see when those elections are happening, or try to figure out, who those elected officials are. Invite those elected officials into your classrooms. This is something else that I created, and this is actually a resource that I got from OPI's website. It's the Montana Indians, their history, and it's a fairly large, or not large, but a thick booklet and book. And so what I did is I went in and I wanted very specific things for my students to know. Like I wanted them to know where the headquarters were for that tribe, estimate of what the enrolled members are. Keep in mind that enrollment changes just about every year for every tribe, because they bring in new members and they have to be recognized by the tribal council. And so that asterisk there is to just, let the person know that's reading this, is that the student might have to research, what is the latest enrollment numbers for that tribe, or, estimate. They can do an estimate of, how much does a tribal enrollment grow. I wanted to know how many acres were within the reservation, and I think I had a typo on here because I think I put 2 acres down on Crow. Let's look. Oh no, I fixed it. Okay. At one time it was just 2 acres, and that's not true. And then roughly about when it was estimated, the tribes that live there, the governing body, how many people, how many council members. And so sometimes those change. Again, like I said, some tribes are changing their constitutions, and one of those is how often they serve and how many people. So I've used this along with that map, and I've had my students do in the past do research. And I say arranged by Leo Whitford, and what I mean is I arranged it so that it fits my need of, I wanted to have information for my students, and then I gave them, a guide of what I wanted next. And so this information is within that document that you see. Here's some of the resources that I had. I didn't get a chance to dump all my links in there, and I will later on. And that way you can kind of see where you can get some of these resources. I just really liked what the National Conservation Lands did here. I think this is a really cool, map of Montana, and then just the flags that go with each reservation. So here's your challenge. Make learning fun, and, challenge your students, and then celebrate the uniqueness of all of those individuals.
Okay, we have a thank you. I always learn so much from these, and this has been my world for over a decade and a half. And so but let's see, I know some tribes in other states have created very lucrative businesses like large casinos and entertainment facilities that bring a lot of money and jobs to their tribe. Obviously, they run this within the tribe. We haven't seen these in Montana, and we do though. Isn't there are casinos on Salish Kootenai? There's a casino and I don't know about other tribes, but I know there's one on Blackfeet. What holds these developments back in Montana, or why haven't some of the Montana tribes created some of these situations here?
So part of that is our location. A lot of our tribes or our reservations in the state are very rural. There isn't a whole lot of, there isn't big populations there. So they have to figure out how to get people to stop as they're traveling through. So like on Blackfeet Reservation, we have 2 highways. We have Highway 2 and Highway 89. And when you go from one side of the state to the other, you're going through Browning. And so, strategically planning where to put a business is important. And so, we have those casinos that are right there. So yeah, we're lacking in the way of numbers coming through our areas. And so that's a part of it. And there's another whole entity when it comes to gaming and the and the different classifications of gaming that tribes can do. And then there's the whole idea of, can tribes go outside of their reservation boundaries to offer those types, buy property and build those. So that's a whole other tribal sovereignty discussion there.
My question is a little bit like more personal, but I remember you being when Governor Bullock did the Eloise Cabell proclamation for Eloise Cabell Day. What does that feel like when you are a legislator and you're a part of the tribe that this incredible Shiro is from? What does that feel like?
Um, Honored. Eloise, she's a lady to be. I mean, she's a lady that just really, she gave it her all, literally gave it her all to fight for the people. And actually when the idea of making Eloise Cabell Day, a state recognized day, we started out, and I say we because Denise Juno was in the office of public instruction. She was a superintendent at the time, and her and I got together, and we were, and a few others wanted to figure out how we could do this piece of legislation, and we tried to get it through the process as a legislator, and it wasn't happening.
Mm.
And so it was disheartening that our state legislators, a number of them weren't in support of it. And so we decided, well, we'll try a different avenue. And we decided to go with the proclamation and ask the governor if he would be willing to do that. And it took a while to, kind of gauge whether that was going to happen or not. And when it did, I just felt it was like a really important piece for us to do, because it had such a impact on tribal nations, not just here, and not just within our tribe, but all across, the United States. And so that was pretty awesome. I enjoyed
It was amazing to be there, just watching the whole thing. And of course Denise invited all of the staff up from Indian Ed, and it was really something to witness that. And when you and I were speaking, and please, if anyone has any questions, please do put them in the chat. We've got a few minutes for questions and answer. But when we talked earlier, I said, gosh, would you ever consider running again? And I think that's such an important question, because it's so easy for us to sit back and go, oh, governments and it's politics and blah blah blah. But at the core of our democracy is our people who are willing to put themselves out there to represent the people, hopefully in the best of faith. And so and your response was, when I said, would you consider running again? Your response,
I said yes. Yes.
And look at that enthusiasm. I love that. I think it's really admirable. And why do you say yes? What are the things that feed you as a legislator?
I think it's just important that people have an opportunity to serve, and a lot of times a number of our legislators, even those that are newly elected into the legislature now, they go down there with the idea that they're wanting to make change. They want to make some good policy. They want to see things different. And yeah, I mean, I enjoyed being involved. I'm still somewhat involved. I work with organizations that get out the vote. And so I think it's important that we exercise that right, and we do it, we make sure we put it in our calendars, and that we're going to vote. And if we can't be there the day of voting, then we're making sure that we're making arrangements ahead of time to get our vote counted, because it is so important. In your federal Indian law and policy, discussions with students, have that discussion about when did Indians get the right to vote, because there's an Indian Citizenship Act. And even though that act took place in, I think it was 24, 1924, some of the tribal people in Montana didn't vote, and it was based on, whether they owned property or if they could prove it. So there's all of these hindrances to allow those allow a certain group to vote or not to vote. And so, I mean, I just think that it's important that we do our part. And yeah, I'm not opposed to not getting into the political ring again. And I shared earlier that one of the reasons why I stepped away from it. Uh-oh. I closed out everything.
Oh, you're good.
Was at the time, one of my kids was, pretty young, and I wanted to make sure that I was there, and family first. And so, it's always possibility, but I think one of the things that we can encourage our kids to do is to think about those possibilities of being, leaders, and what does that look like. And they have lots of opportunity to try it out.
I do wonder what kind of conversations happen, in various classrooms at various stages about, what it would be like to be a legislator. And it was really exciting when you said earlier in your presentation, have legislators in, and, secret, Indian Ed for All has a line in on some legislators that would be more than happy to come into your classroom. So you just hit Mike Jetty up and he'll make it happen. Well, you can hit any of us up, but really just hit Mike Jetty up. And we would,
you make a really good point there. And let's go ahead and let everybody know that, you can go to the legislature, and when they're in session, and you can go and visit the Capitol, and let your kiddo see, that whole process in action. And I think that's really a cool thing to do. The other thing is, in every one of these, I don't know that we have anybody from out of state, but all of you have that representative or that senator in your area. Call them up and ask them to come in and speak to your classrooms. I did that. I used to have legislators come in and speak to my students, and talk about, the process. And they get an opportunity to see who these individuals are. And I think we can do that for our tribal governments as well.
I think that's really, especially with tribal governments, if you're living near a reservation, living near a tribe, one thing that I found out is, I came to Montana not knowing anything about tribal governance, tribal councils. That was a whole new part of Indian Ed for me to learn. And as I've spoken with former council members and current council members, I'm thinking of Vernon Finley in particular, he had so much knowledge to share and was really excited that someone wanted to know about, how his particular tribal government, worked. And it's, yes, I've just found that people are a wealth of knowledge and so willing to share. But I just looked at the time, and we are actually, we're there. We made it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes,
thank you, everybody.
Lots of thank yous in the chat. But just a reminder, please have a wonderful and a safe week next week, no matter what you're doing or how you are honoring it. And then the 29th of November, again, we will have Wes Martell. And then on the 1st, we will have Shane Margeau. The week after that, we will have Mike Jetty. And then the week after that will be our final week. And that will be Tuesday with Casey Lozar, who Leah referred to earlier. And we will end with Donnie Wetzel. And so we have just such an amazing lineup. Leah, thank you so much for everything that you shared. And I will just email me any of the resources. I did add a few of them as we went.
Okay, I see that.
Email those to me, and I'll be happy to add those. And thank you all so much for being here tonight. Stay warm, stay safe, and Leah, Ixakapi.
Oh, thank you.
Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.